Your Excellency, Professor Chalmers, distinguished guests, and everyone joining us tonight both in person and online, good evening. I'm Mary Cooloff, the President of the Royal Society of Tasmania. Tonight's event is presented jointly by the Royal Society and the Tasmanian branch of ATSE, the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. I'd like to introduce you to my co-host for tonight's event, Professor Jim Reid, sitting in the front row, Chair of the Tasmanian Division of the Academy. Welcome to everyone joining us tonight. We are delighted to be joined by distinguished guests, the Honourable Barbara Baker, Governor of Tasmania, and Professor Chalmers, Ms Cassie O'Connor, MP, Leader of the Tasmanian Greens, the Honourable Mike Gaffney, MLC, the Honourable Rob Valentine, MLC, Professor Anthony Koutoulis, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at the University of Tasmania, and Professor Matt King, Director of the Australian Centre for Excellence in Antarctic Science. As we gather for this meeting from different places around Australia, on behalf of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering and the Royal Society of Tasmania, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we meet. I'm joining you tonight from Palawa land. I pay respect to elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who join us this evening. As we share and discuss our own knowledge and practices, we acknowledge the deep knowledge forever embedded in custodianship of country. Firstly, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the two host institutions and why we are holding this event. The Academy of Technology and Engineering, ATSE, is a distinguished national body that promotes and recognises excellence in the technological sciences and engineering. Some of the finest minds in the country are numbered among its fellows, and some of those people are here with us tonight. Welcome to all the fellows and supporters joining us tonight, in person and online. The Royal Society of Tasmania is the oldest scientific institution in Australia. It is a society of volunteers working assiduously to advance knowledge since 1843, especially knowledge relevant to Tasmania. So why are we holding tonight's event? The scientific evidence for global warming is unequivocal. Australia, like the rest of the world, faces serious challenges as a consequence of this. To avoid the widespread and dangerous impacts of climate change, strong action is required. We face some challenging questions. How can we reduce the rate of warming in the global climate system? How can future climate change risks be managed? And how can the impact of current and future climate-related stresses be reduced? Tonight's speakers have all been selected to tell us more about the challenges we face and the mitigation and adaptation responses that are possible. Now about the format of tonight's event. Our three speakers, Professor Nathan Bindoff, Professor Mary O'Kane and Mr Andrew Catchpole, will each give a short presentation, followed by some brief questions from the audience, with a panel discussion and more questions at the end. My co-host tonight, Professor Jim Reid, will coordinate the question sessions. And people joining us online are invited to type questions into the Q&A button on your screen, and a selection of these questions will be asked. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be available soon on the Royal Society's YouTube channel. Our first speaker tonight is Nathan Bindoff, who is Professor of Physical Oceanography at the University of Tasmania at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies. He is one of the world's leading climate change scientists. Nathan has been a coordinating lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, 3 times. He contributed to the IPCC winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, shared with Al Gore. And Nathan was part of the team that coined the phrase, "Global warming is unequivocal." His talk title tonight is Emerging New Climate States, Tipping Points and Extreme Weather in Our Potential Future. Thank you, Nathan.
Thank you very much, Mary, for that lovely introduction. It's actually a pleasure to be here. The last time I spoke in the Stanley Burbury Theatre was a debate with Ian Plimer, and the wonderful thing is you've talked about global warming being unequivocal. It helps me in my shave a minute off my talk, because I was going to start with the discussion of the fact that in the IPCC, over a period of 25 years, we've been talking about the presence of human influence to explain global climate change. And now that language is actually strengthened over the, from the second assessment report to the third assessment report, to the fourth assessment report, to the fifth. And in the fifth, we actually said it's extremely likely that humans' influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. And the word extremely likely means there's a 5% chance we are wrong. And the flip side, of course, is that we're 95% sure. So that allows me now to talk about the things that are interesting about the stories and why we're going to be surprised by the climate change in our potential future, because there are things that we haven't probably understood as well as we could as a climate change community. The emergence of new climate states, the presence of potential tipping points that will be recognised more and more, the subtleties of extreme weather and the impacts that has in our current future, our current time, and in the potential future that we have, a choice around. So let me take you through this slide. This slide, along with all the other slides almost, come from the latest report of the IPCC, the Special Report on Oceans and Climate Change, in a changing climate. And it's only because of their contributions that I can really give this talk. But let me just run you through thinking about this first panel here. The climate system we're forcing, of course, there's rising greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, so that's one way to think about this. This is the forcing that we're applying to the Earth system. The Earth system, of course, composed of the atmosphere, the ocean, the cryosphere, and the geophysical Earth as well. And then, of course, if you think about it, the rising CO2 into the atmosphere against some part of this climate system could evoke all sorts of responses. It could be a no response. It could be a delayed response. The oceans are a classic delay in the Earth system. They store heat and then come to equilibrium much later. So the oceans are a very classic example of a delayed response to the rising greenhouse gases. Surface temperature of the Earth is much closer to a linear response, having a shorter time, and more or less, and we can have some other discussions about that, more or less follows the forcing itself. And then there are systems in the Earth system, and ice sheets are an example of it, where there can be thresholds. Ecosystems are another example, where there's a critical change and it's abrupt and non-linear, and I'll show an example of that at the end. So this is the sort of system we're actually dealing with. There's a variety of responses to the human emissions which are expressed through the things that we care about, whether it's ocean warming or surface temperature or the ecosystems that I will show in some of the later talks. Now, one of the things that people don't talk much about is this idea of the time of emergence. It's the fact actually that we will have in the future totally new climates. They're totally new in the sense that if you think about this early record here, it has a signal in it, it has a variability associated with it. And as we force the response of the Earth into a different place, that variability becomes different from the pre-industrial variability. And this illustration here shows where that becomes the point or time of emergence of the new climate state. And I'll show in this presentation some tipping points. I won't talk about detection and attribution. I'll show some tipping points. And here's a classic figure illustrating the concept of tipping points. We could have two stable states, a stable state here and one with an even more stable state. But maybe actually when you shift and add the warming to the planet, you shift the state here, eventually arriving at a point where in fact now we move to this state, that we have tipped from this state to that state. And this is tipping points are part of the Earth system, and I'll show an example of that around the question of ice sheets in Antarctica. And then finally, as we've got more sophisticated in our thinking around climate change, thinking about extremes and how they couple together, here is an illustration. We've been forcing the system. It affects the physical system, the biogeochemical changes that might go with ocean acidification, for example. That has consequences for the biological systems and ecosystems that we depend on as humans. And these things can actually cascade up, and I'll illustrate an example of that in our own state of Tasmania later in the talk. So these are the basic sorts of ideas we can have about how the Earth system might respond to rising greenhouse gases. And all of them are there. All of them are potential hazards going into the future. Now, I'll just use an example of a tipping point, and it's a really nice one and relevant to my new job as in the Australian Antarctic Program Partnership. And it's this picture here. In the long term, in the very long term, I'm very conscious I have some experts in the room, sea level is really all about land ice and the amount of land ice that's actually stored principally in Greenland and Antarctica. If we were to melt Antarctica in this picture here, we could add 57 metres of sea level globally, if we could melt it all. But the real thing is that actually the accumulation and precipitation over Antarctica flows towards the fringe. And around Antarctica, we have this system of ice shelves which are connected to the oceans, and it's this connection to the oceans that can lead to marine ice sheet instability, and that is the purpose of this slide. Now, this is a very interesting example of something that we can begin in our climate system, and maybe has already begun, as I'll show in a moment. Here is a picture of an ice sheet, and the most important part in this particular panel is the retrograde slope here. So the slope beneath the ice sheet actually goes down as you progress towards the South Pole. And let's suppose there's some warm water here, and the warm water was actually to enter into this cavity. So the ocean cavity above, you've got the ice shelf. And let's suppose that it begins to melt here. And if it melts enough, you'll actually erode that back. And because it's deeper, it actually melts faster. You depress the freezing temperature even further, and it erodes even faster, and then it will melt away, and then it erodes further, and it melts away. And in the process of melting away on this retrograde slope is that actually you thin also the shelf itself, and you increase the slope here. And because ice flows pretty much down gravity, the thinning of that ice sheet accelerates, because of the increase in slope, it accelerates the flow of ice through the ice shelf itself. And what we have in this situation with this retrograde slope is a system that tends to retreat and retreat and retreat. And as it retreats, it adds mass to the oceans, causing sea level to go up. And it's not until, in fact, the slope changes that this mass ice shelf instability actually comes to an end. There's a second kind of instability as well, where if you have meltwater on the surface of the ice shelf here, you can actually get that meltwater freezing again in the crevasses that actually are many on the ice shelves, and that freezing can cause stress changes within the ice shelf itself, and as a consequence lead to a breakup of the ice shelf itself. And this little movie here of the Larsen B ice shelf in March 2002, where you can see the blueness of the meltwaters, it broke out in a period of 2 months. It actually added a significant contribution to sea level in that short period. There was a rapid acceleration of the glaciers behind. That's just one example of an instability. And then when you combine it with the fact that we've got increasing level of knowledge about the amount of area of Antarctica that has this retrograde slope. We understood West Antarctica in the distant past, but it's become more understood that East Antarctica over here also is submerged below sea level and has this retrograde slope, opening up an increased amount of Antarctica that can contribute to sea level rise. We know that Antarctica is actually losing mass currently, and over the last 30 years we've lost enough mass to contribute about 8 millimetres of sea level. It's really quite an innocent sea level change at this moment. Greenland has contributed a bit more with about 12 millimetres of sea level up to 2018. We also know that precisely the areas where we have the retrograde slope beneath the ice shelves, we actually have very strong thinning. We can measure the height of the ice shelf and the ice sheet, and you can watch it change in dimension and thin out. And these areas that are thinning out here are precisely where you'd expect the marine ice sheet instability to exist. And also you can see some thinning going on, beginning to go on here in the East Antarctic region. Some of this has now been combined in the estimates, and the most recent estimates from the Special Report on Oceans and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate include some estimates of what the future projections. These are actually very modest projections compared to those published in the literature, but in this assessment released in 2019, you can see that there's somewhere between, for a high emission scenario, so this is a high emission scenario, somewhere between 5 metres to a little over 2 metres in 2300. So this is looking out into the future on a long time scale. High emissions trajectory shows an enormous sea level rise committed with that high emission scenario. For a low emission scenario, you actually get a number that's more like 1.1 or 1.2 metres by 2300 for the low emission scenario. So these long-term projections show radical changes in our coastlines. So while I've sort of emphasised the long term, now let's actually come closer to the present and think about how these changes, relatively small changes, manifest themselves in terms of sea level rise and extremes. Here is a classic picture that caught the imagination of Australia, the collapse of this swimming pool and the story that might go around that collapse. But what I'd really like to draw your attention to is what's an acceptable risk. In the past, a 1 in 100 year event might be considered an acceptable risk. And here what we're going to show is the change in a 1 in 100 year event in the historical record with the current levels of sea level rise and projected sea level rise to the 1 in 1 year. And I'm going to talk about the emergence of this so I'll skip this figure, and I'm now going to talk about the emergence of the 1 in 100 year event becoming an annual event. Forget about these figures here and focus in on the red square. And I'll apologise for the size of some of these dots. But what I want you to look at is this scale here. This scale here shows 2000. And black would indicate that this is the year that a 1 in 100 year event became annual. And if you look in this figure here, a lot of these island nations in the Western Pacific, in the mid-latitude, in the equatorial band of the Indian and in the East Pacific, are often black. So what that means is, in fact, that the small amount of sea level rise that we've already observed, so over the last century it was 170 millimetres, already that's having enough impact to shift the 1 in 100 year event to an annual event in many places, particularly small island developing states and other low-lying places, the home of roughly 680 million people on the globe. We can also see that, say, for Australia, that under this high emission scenario, that the emergence of this 1 to 100 year event becoming annual is in the period of somewhere between 2040 and 2060, really quite close in time. So you can see that even with small sea level changes, there are some dramatic changes in the extreme events across the globe. The oceans also suffer, and I want to now kind of get you thinking about what the oceans are composed of. The oceans, of course, are the home of many ecosystems. They have surface pH, so there's a chemistry, there's a surface temperature and temperatures inside. There's an oxygen minimum actually within the oceans, an important layer for the setting habitat for ecosystems. There's nitrate and net primary productivity. These are all fundamental things for ecosystems to live in. And what we can see here is the area of the ocean that is actually emerging out of the past variability and climate. And what you can see is that they don't all emerge together. They actually emerge in a sequence progressively. So ocean acidification, surface pH here shown in the black line, has the least variability associated with it. And it emerges, so it's 70% of the area of the globe, has actually moved from the old pH climate to the new pH climate. And you can see actually by the 1950s, you've covered most of the Earth's surface, and by the year 2000, so we've come to the present, all of the Earth has actually altered its surface pH. For surface temperature, it's a bit different. It occurs much later, its emergence, 50% by 1975, 80%, 90% by the year 2000. So that's a very robust signal covering most of the globe, already experiencing a change in its climate state. And then for the other variables, which have more variability, a little bit more uncertainty, they emerge progressively and later in time. So if you depend on these variables, what it really means is the environment that you live in has actually changed, and its sequence of change is not the way you would necessarily expect it to be. And it was a conclusion in the last report about the emergence of these shift in the climate, the new ocean states, progressively across those different indices. And then we need to pay more attention to extremes. It's extraordinary, in fact, that the Hurricane Harvey created 125 billion of economic losses. But even at home, we can see coinciding extreme events lead to magnified problems. So it's an example Our example here is, and it was actually reported in the IPCC report, was the case study of Tasmania in 2015, 2016. Some people in the front row will remember those years very keenly. There was an extraordinary heat wave driven in part by the East Australian current, lasted 250 days. It was so warm, actually, it caused disease and mortality in the abalone, oyster and salmon industries, so there were losses there. Because it coincided, or perhaps because it was coincided with an El Nino event, there was an extraordinary drought and a power emergency that our third speaker might mention in his talk. There was also remarkable wildfires in our southwest in that same year, and we had the energy shortages as well. And then it was capped off with the most expensive part of the disaster from the government's perspective, when there was an extreme flood and bridges were washed away. We estimated that actually for the Tasmanian government, it was $300 million of damage for something that was almost certainly exceptional and coupled. It cascaded together and compounded to add to the level of damage. And then finally, I want to talk about some work that one of my colleagues, Beck Harris, has done, and it's really just trying to push home the message that we're in a complicated world, but the consequences can be understood, and particularly in some of our ecosystems. Just think of, we have an annual cycle here in the top line. We have, of course, we have weather events that occur, very short-lived, very quick, the things that we understand. And then we have an underlying world where climate change is actually increasing. And then we have systems, and kelp is an example of such a system in the right place, where there are extinction because it's crossed a critical barrier, or whether it's survivable, and then it takes a long time to grow back. And it's the long time to grow back and recover that's an important part of this narrative. So what happens is something really quite innocent happening here. This is what you experience as an ecosystem, for instance, like the kelp example I have in the top right panel here. And eventually you start to have these events which cause your population to plummet, and then suddenly actually something happens and the population plummets altogether. And that's precisely what happened in the marine heat wave on this particular kelp forest. It actually led to a barren shortly after. The example below is actually Delegatensis, which had successive fires come through, and those successive fires came through within the time of, it takes 30 years for Delegatensis to actually to reseed, and so the fires came through rapidly enough, frequently enough, that they actually killed off the entire region. And that leads to a localised collapse of that particular ecosystem. It's this convolution or joining or compounding, whatever you want to use, of things that we understand, weather events, critical thresholds, underlying climate, that leads actually to these surprising declines in and collapses in ecosystems. We shouldn't be surprised that there'll be more of those, because there are many of those sorts of ecosystems in the Earth system itself. And so just to finish off, I've really just talked about the hazards of climate change. My colleagues here, Mary and Andrew, are going to kind of start to address some of the questions around how we might reduce the exposure to those hazards, how to reduce our vulnerability to those hazards. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Nathan. I'm sure Nathan is more than happy to answer a few brief questions before we move on. Is there anybody who has a question? There are some roving mics that need to be passed out for anybody who wishes to have a question.
They're overwhelmed.
If there are no questions, Nathan, can I ask one? On a slide 3 or 4 from the end, you indicated that Tasmania was going to have yearly catastrophes from about 2040 onwards. It was in purple. And you illustrated a few of those on the second last slide. Do you think marine heat waves, El Nino events, droughts are going to become absolutely regular every year, or are you saying one such event each year might occur?
What I will say, Jim, is actually the frequency of such events will go up and we'll get surprises. This event that I've got here is a surprise because it started off with a very dry spring and winter that led to almost a collapse of our energy system. It ended with a record flood in the northern part. And they're almost contradictory, but these are things that we can expect, these sort of moving system with a slow underlying climate change signal.
Thank you. Is there a question from the audience or a question online?
No, nothing at the moment, Jim.
Well, if that's the case, thank you very much, Nathan.
Our second speaker tonight is Professor Mary O'Kane. Mary is a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Technology and Engineering. She chairs the boards of Aurora Energy and the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies, IMAS. Mary is also chair of the New South Wales Independent Planning Commission, a company director and executive chairman of O'Kane Associates, a company advising governments and the private sector on innovation, research, education and development. She was New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer from 2008 to 2018, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Adelaide from 1996 to 2001. She has served on several boards and committees in the public and private sectors, especially related to energy, engineering, Antarctica, ICT and research. She is a member of the board of the Innovative Manufacturing Cooperative Research Centre. Mary also carries out reviews in a wide range of fields in many countries. She was recently one of the 2 leaders of the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry. And her talk title tonight is Cautionary Tales from New South Wales, Bushfires and Mitigation. Thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. Your Excellency, distinguished colleagues, it's wonderful to be here. I feel a bit of a fraud talking about New South Wales bushfires when you have perfectly respectable bushfires of your own here in Tasmania. And I first learnt about the science of bushfires actually from a Tasmanian. Some of you might remember Roger Wettenhall, a very famous in Australian terms public admin researcher, who had been at the University of Tasmania, and I got to know when he was at the University of Canberra as the head of the School of Public Admin. And he wrote a wonderful book called Bushfire, way back on the big fire, 69 or 70, wasn't it? And it's a great read because it's the story of a young academic stuck on in his university offices, the bushfires coming on, and his family's out on the edge of the city, affected by the bushfire. And he talks about it, his panic, and at the same time the public admin consequences. It's if you find it in a remainder books, grab it and read it. Okay, so here we go. But I want to talk about these bushfires because these are the ones I got to know extremely well to the point of having nightmares in the first half of last year. So the Premier of New South Wales asked me and Dave Owens, a former Deputy Commissioner of Police, who'd been Head of Emergency Services, to do this inquiry. And I'm going to, unlike Nathan's calm, wonderful presentation, this is going to be a very rapid tour through a large number of slides. But if you want to read all the slides, I can make them available online or something, but I'm just going to race through. So just quickly, what we were asked to do in the inquiry. to look at the causes and contributing factors, causes of the fires and the contributing factors to them, preparation for, response to, but not do recovery. And I'm going to concentrate on the causes of the fires and the contributing factors and the policy implications of that. Just so they were the worst fires in record. The fires across Australia that year were the worst forest fires in recorded history in the world. It's thought that there were fires of this kind about 1574, but we don't absolutely know, and there's really no other knowledge here. 5.5 million hectares, 26 lives lost, and loads of other statistics, but it's that size which is the amazing one. There were fires, as you remember, that year. You didn't have big fires that year, but Queensland, Victoria, South Australia did, and so there were inquiries in all those places. The Commonwealth had the Royal Commission and parallel Royal Commissions across the states. There were various other related inquiries on. There have always been inquiries in Australia into bushfires. Been over 114 since 1927, but it's fascinating that 99 of those were since 1990. There's a lot of recurring themes. We had somebody go through and read all of them, and you can see a pattern. But we tend to break the pattern, as you'll see. So what did we do? Process-wise, we hopped in helicopters and we went over the fire grounds to look at them. We raced around fireground to fireground because COVID was coming on, and got almost over everything before COVID hit. We managed to hold a few community meetings before COVID hit, and after that we did them online. It's amazing holding great big Zoom meetings with, 60 people crying. It was really, they had been devastating fires. And we held meetings with all the relevant fire agencies, the Rural Fire Service, Fire and Rescue New South Wales, National Parks, Wildlife Forest Corps, the official firefighting agencies of New South Wales. But we also talked to their incident management teams, the teams that manage the firefighting, multi-agency, often with international, interstate people in them. We met with all the various agencies of state that were involved. Had a wonderful time talking to the fire and weather experts, and there are lots of them in us. Luckily, Australia has built up a great deal of expertise. Some of it was things like the Bushfire and Natural Hazard CRC, but obviously the Bureau of Meteorology was a big thing. The Centre of Excellence in Climate Extremes that the University of Tasmania is a part of, very important part of, was part of our story. And we held various roundtables on all various things, but I'll come to the findings of the research hub, but on things like Indigenous land management, not just Indigenous burning. The big thing was Indigenous land management. I'd like to particularly pay tribute to the amount of work and help we got from Tasmania, and to say that Professor David Bowman, who's a pyrogeographer, really helped us think through the issues. Nobody's better than David at explaining, in finding beautiful language to describe fire and beautiful concepts for it. And his spouse, Faye Johnston, who of course is Australia's leading expert on bushfire smoke. And that had been pretty important to New South Wales because we'd all been living in smoke for months through those fires. So in terms of process, we felt into blaming anyone. It was important to sort of be constructive in terms of things. We called to submissions. We held lots of community meetings, as I mentioned, met with all those groups and did the flyovers and so on. Sorry. In terms of the submissions, we had almost 2,000 submissions. It's interesting to notice what they're about. Hazard reduction, climate change, and some people obviously spoke about more than one issue. So, what is it, about almost 700 on hazard reduction. I think it is a very large number on climate change. Then you'll see a lot about things like national parks and wildlife, what that is about, and forestry, where people felt they were living next to national park and they blame national parks and wildlife for not reducing the hazard. So there was a fair, if we weren't blaming everything, everyone else was busily blaming everyone else. But it was a very interesting outline of what was going on. Some of the things we heard as repeated messages, We were told in the public meetings that the fires were largely caused by arson, that the big problem, and this was said again and again and again, was that fuel loads had been allowed to build up, and if that hadn't happened, the fires wouldn't have been as bad as they were. We were told that stay and defend is what people understood they should do, although that got watered down. And of course, the Fires Near Me app, everybody had the Fires Near Me app, and lots of people said it was great, except those who were really close to the fire edge who said it was awful. So looking into the scale and cause and contributing factors issue. So I'm just going to really race through this. A few interesting things about it. The fire season went for an incredible 8 months, from July of 2019 through to March of 2020. That is a large portion of any year. The fire season, when it comes, and there's a fire season every year, generally moves from north to south. It did move from north to south, but it stayed going in the north when it was firing up in the south. So this really stretched resources. And the big sort of challenge for the RFS and all the other fire agencies was the large number of fires that were running simultaneously, and how did you source it? Particularly as all the help that you were getting from interstate often had to fly home to deal with their own fires. And from places coming from somewhere like North America, they were exhausted because they'd been fighting their own and of course had to go back to fight more. So this picture, this map of New South Wales, the different colours, don't bother with the fine detail, but the different colours show different times when the fires came on. And the very fact that you can see some purple up in the north at the time the purple is coming on in the south is this whole business of the north was still going when the south blew up. And so that's why, if any of you were visiting Sydney for the fireworks that year, why that was all so bad when the south went up on New Year's Eve. In terms of compared to other fires that we'd had in New South Wales, we'd had some very big ones, but the 1920 was really the corker. So what were they like? Well, many of them were extreme. Many of them led to these fire-generated sort of firestorms of various kinds that were sort of generated out of the weather and coupled with the weather systems. And so there were many of those interspersed with what you might think of normal scary bushfires, blow-up events. It's very interesting listening to the fire world. They talk about fires as living things. They take runs, they put out a finger, they stooge around, they race through things, they creep about, they pop up. You know, listening to the fireys talk is fascinating, and their talk about certain of these fires was quite different to their talk about others. It was very interesting that generally the RFS operates on the principle that the fires don't go much at night. So there are many farmers in the RFS. They assume they can get home, have a meal, milk the cows and come back and fight the fires the next day. These ones went in many cases at night, and that surprised things, stretched resources and showed a new form of fire. There was an incredible number of lightning was the big cause of ignitions, but the other big cause of fires was embers going a long way forward and front. And the other thing that was noted, and this goes to the extreme fires, was that the fires were spreading in all directions at the same time. You got fires actually advancing into the wind, running straight over recently hazard-reduced areas. Fires which had sort of areas that had burnt over earlier in the season, re-burnt. They sort of walked across sheets of water. It was, you know, things people hadn't seen, it was there. And you noticed in particular really scary noises. And as I said, the embers shooting very far ahead. How far ahead? We had some proof from the clear range fire of over 7 kilometres ahead, but there was talk of some that went about 20 kilometres. We turn to the so-called Bushfire Management, Risk Management Research Hub for a lot of help with a lot of questions, and David Bowman also helped out, as did a lot of other researchers on these. And this is a hub, a research group that's between a variety of New South Wales universities and the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. And they had been brought together some time before and proved to be a wonderful resource. And sorry, I should just wait there. We put a lot of questions to them, and the next set of slides come from the answers that they got by going through all the massive amounts of data, at least to try and answer the things we wanted. The first thing they pointed out was the 4 ingredients of serious fire were present: spatially contiguous fuel, the dryness of the fuel and its availability to burn, incredible dryness, weather conducive to fire spread, high temperatures, low humidity, wind, and ignition sources, which was lightning and embers. So why did they burn like this? First, we had been in a very long drought. Matter of fact, we could have had fires of this kind 1 year ahead, but certainly we were sort of due for a fire at some point. The fuel was really dry, and that means when lightning struck, and there was loads of lightning that summer, it just started new fires. There was extremely bad fire days and nights where there was low humidity, wind, super hot. The temperature just didn't really go down. And then you got these extreme dynamic fires, these extreme fires, these sort of, fire-generated thunderstorms of various kinds, which go by various names, but these were, and I'll show you a picture that everybody uses about them shortly. Ember spotting was intense, and the embers often just stayed glowing and then just blew everything up. And it was very challenging to detect new embers and to get to new ignitions. And the other thing that was going on, so a lot of this is sort of the natural world, but when humans tried to fight them, there was so much smoke that often you couldn't get the line scanning aircraft up, so we didn't know where the edge of the fire was. So even though Australia has incredible capability in spatial science, we hadn't ever really honed it in and refined it so that we could track fires. So we were relying on line scanner aircraft. Resources, as I said, were incredibly stretched, and nobody had plans for fighting at night. Just picking up on something Nathan said, it's important to note that, as I said, the weather was truly terrible in various ways. And when you note that you've got some of these strong droughts, they're often coupled with really interesting climate drivers. In our case, it was a long-lived positive Indian Ocean dipole and a negative southern annular mode. But this has been noted with a lot of these bad seasons in previous years, where it's been a mixture of interesting climate drivers and a drought. Seems to be an important signal. I'd mentioned the hazard reduction stuff, and you could go on for hours about hazard reduction, and I won't. But I will speak briefly to say that everyone was convinced that the problem was hazard reduction, and yet the work of the hub suggested it wasn't, that the fuel levels were on average no higher than they'd been for 30 years, but the fuel was so dry that when it got struck by lightning or an ember, it just went boom and went up. And so this was a very hard message, but I really hand it to the politicians in New South Wales. They took it on board and were willing to accept it wasn't the hazard reduction issue. As I said, weather was a really big issue in here. High temperatures overnight, high solar insolation, low humidity, this coupling to these fire-generated thunderstorms, these incredible dry winds and so on. A very interesting person on all of this is Jason Sharples, who's at ADFA, at University of New South Wales, Canberra, if you like, at the Defence Force Academy. And he in particular has been talking about these fire-generated thunderstorms and these extreme fires. And Jason and his colleagues who do a lot of this work talk about the age of the Pyrocene, and that we're in an age of great fire and really unusual fire. And I just mention his name because if you're interested in reading about this, reading Jason's work is particularly interesting. This picture you will find this picture in every report of the Royal Commissions of all the state reports on bushfires of 1920. This is one generated, a good picture generated by the bomb, which gives an idea of a fire-generated thunderstorm, a great plume going up into the atmosphere, causing more thunderstorms, often quite a distance away, 10, 12 kilometres away, lots of lightning downbursts and black hail, which is not shown on that. But if you're in one of these, the message is get out. You cannot fight these fires. At least we can't at the moment. And it's really interesting, if you look at the number of fire-generated thunderstorms that have been reported, they went up half as much again in the 1920 season. So up to that, the highest number for the 18-19 season had been 60, and then it went up to 90 in that year. Suddenly, we're seeing a great, you can see from that graph, a great increase of them, and then a sharp turn upwards. I won't speak at length about the bushfire smoke issue. You've got your own expert in Faye Johnston down here. Get her to talk about it. But I mentioned that 26 too many lives were lost in the New South Wales fires. But as Faye has pointed out to us, we probably lost a lot more people from that smoke. And this is it's something we need to do a lot more of in Australia. I now want to move to the whole issue of policy issues from this. And I'm quickly going through, there were 76 recommendations, and to its credit, the New South Wales Government accepted all 76, and to its credit, has actually funded in a sort of half budget of last year and the budget that came down yesterday, all to respond to all 76. There are various things that come out of it. One of it is about communication. We need to be told when to expect fires. Now, there's some debate about whether you can do this because people turn off, but I think it's really important that there is an annual statement and it rates the fires, because you can tell when it's likely, not absolutely certain, that these are going to come. An incredibly important thing, now I've used yellow for things that are very important, red for super important, is education. We don't fully understand what part of the pyrocene we might be in by now, but we do need to keep educating ourselves about this different sort of fire, these extreme fires. And so education needs to be everything from school, from talk about it, and not shy away from it just because we've suddenly had storms and COVID since. We need to keep watching for these. We need accurate warnings. Fires Near Me as an app needs to work, not like friends of mine who were in the little town of Cobargo, who woke up, they had the Fires Near Me app and it said the fires were coming, but they'd be starting to get to the edges of Cobargo at about 3 p.m. They woke up at 2 a.m. to hear a scary roaring noise, to find the fire on the hill behind them, and it was one of these extreme events. And luckily they got out, but lots of people in Cobargo died and there was a lot of loss of property and life. And we really need then to move to this use down further in the thing where I say develop technologies, to use the technology expertise we actually have in Australia to push it to bushfires so that we have the technology to know where the edge of the fire is, what at least to give us a chance of what we can fight and how we can get people out. Above all, we need further research on all of this. We need to understand these types of fires. And that in turn feeds into the education and the warnings. And some of all of this is counterintuitive because we're saying with a lot of it is you can't fight them. And I'll come on to more of this. We need to become ready for fighting extreme fires, or more importantly, knowing when that we can't fight them and how to get everybody, the firefighters, everyone out of the way. We need to get much better at attacking fires early. Get them out as soon as they spot. And again, this is about detecting fires, moving quickly and accepting you're not going to be able to get everything out. We need to improve our night firefighting capability. And that's in terms of equipment, automatically, and having people do it. Then there's loads and loads of very important recommendations that I'm not going to go through. For example, what do we do in the planning system? There are parts of New South Wales that we probably shouldn't have people living in. Or if they live in them, should we let them be able to get insurance, or will insurance come to them and so on? But there's a lot, if you want to read about it, it's a big, thick inquiry, but it's all there. We above all need to attend to infrastructure. The thing people got most upset about, strangely enough, overall, was not that they got cut off in terms of roads and things, it was that their mobile phone went down. They couldn't communicate. It was a very first world issue. but an incredibly important one when they couldn't communicate or couldn't get messages about the fires to know what they should do. It is very scary. We found that the fire trails were in bad shape. There's all sorts of things around there, but are going to be attacked. There are places that are definitely too dangerous to live in New South Wales. Sometimes some of these areas deep in the forest where there's only one road in, one road out, like a single road, and which are, completely surrounded by dense eucalypts. There are probably places nobody should be there. We need to talk more and more about evacuation arrangements. You all remember pictures of people getting out off the beaches at Merimbula and so on. How we can get people out. That can definitely be improved. And how we keep firefighters, who are such an important part of our community, safe. So returning to those popular beliefs I talked about at the start, fires were largely caused by arson. Well, no, they weren't. They were caused by, the fuel was really dry and so on, but the actual immediate cause was lightning and ember spotting. The problem was the fuel loads that had been allowed to build up there, so the hazard reduction problem. No, it wasn't. It was that there was a lot of fuel, it was contiguous, it was extremely dry, and there was loads of sources of starting the fires, and it blew up. Stay and defend is the right approach. Less and less often is that the right approach. Get out is probably the message, and absolutely when there's a chance of these blow up extreme fires. And Fires Near Me is a great app. Well, it's going to be a lot better, we hope, very soon. So, the big messages out of these fires, which do raise some really interesting questions for policy, are the worst forest fires in recorded history. The Californian ones have been bad, but they're not as bad as ours. We have worse fires than they had, sort of thing. Ours are worse than theirs. They are big bad fires and they're coming again. I felt as though I sang a little Wiggles song through most of the end of the fires, saying the big bad fires and they're coming again. They're definitely coming again. And if you look backwards to the big Canberra fires of about, what was it, 2013 or somewhere, and then back to Black Saturday in Victoria, Canberra fires were 2002-3, and then Black Saturday, and probably the 2013 Tathra fires in New South Wales, and several others in Australia. They are these extreme fires. So we're seeing more and more of them, and I showed you that the fire-generated thunderstorm graph. A big message is if you're told to get out, you get out. And get out becomes much more important. We need to be much cleverer with technologies. It's not often a matter of inventing a technology, but deploying a technology. And probably to spend money on big hovering drones and so on. Because if these fires are coming again, we need to know where the edges are and what is happening. And there's a horrible tragedy, but it could also be an economic and social opportunity. It's a little bit like the situation in the Netherlands. In the 1950s, as you know, a lot of the Netherlands is below sea level. In the 1950s, there were some dreadful floods and they lost the whole villages. And the Dutch government decided they would never lose another life to flood, and they haven't. And they've become absolute experts at managing the sort of floods that come in countries like theirs. And, that's why you have Dutch experts around the world. I think for Australia, we have to become the absolute experts in this. And from a policy point of view, a lot of this is different to what we generally do in fighting fires. So you can imagine the fights we had with the RFS, talking about it, and why it was great for me to have Dave there who'd worked with them over the years. And there's this question about planning where you should live, where you shouldn't. We almost lost the Minister for Transport and Roads. He almost resigned from the Berejiklian government because the government wouldn't agree to put great big shoulders on the roads, which would of course cost a super fortune. But in terms of getting people out, our roads aren't good enough and things. So it raises enormous, in almost all portfolios of government, it raises some really interesting questions. But they're big bad fires and they're coming again. And I will leave that one for you to look at while Mary introduces Andrew, or I answer questions or something.
Okay, are there questions? Wait for a mic, please.
I'll put some glasses on.
My name's Peter Hicken and I live 40 kilometres from here in the bush in the summer. And I've banned the fire brigade, and most of the things you say are not quite correct. The fire brigade actually, by your techniques, prime the landscape to burn. So I'm at war with the fire service, and I've had everybody from the fire chief down on my property saying you can't burn that. But the Aboriginal burning season is you burn breaks in the spring and then burn December, January, February is the fire season, and you burn. And you burn to make it rain. That's about it. I don't know really what to say.
Well, I think we all used to say things like that. Jason Sharples is Indigenous. And he says that probably it's different.
For instance, a eucalypt tree, if you burn it the right way, according to the Aboriginals, is a fungus that lives under the bark and it makes the bark flammable. Now, I burn my trees at the right time and you burn them up and you don't scorch the leaves, the trees flourish, but the next fire, the trees won't burn. They just won't burn.
No, and I've seen examples of it. I agree with you. I have seen that effect. And, people sort of were showing us some of that in the aftermath, but it does seem something else is happening that's coming across that style of fire. Let's talk afterwards. I would like to talk to you.
Question down the front.
There's a lady at the back.
Mary, I'm just interested to know whether there was a wider recognition in the New South Wales case of a connection with climate change, or was that just sort of well and truly beyond?
No, it was acknowledged, the Premier said at the time, sorry, I should have said that it was acknowledged that it was connected to climate change, and that was sort of in the detailed terms of reference. But
so in terms of the government response, is there a change
and the
in
Premier
policy
said every time we are looking at an effect of climate change.
Yeah.
Question here. Thanks. I had a similar question on whether any of the recommendations included larger scale actions like reducing Australia's carbon footprint or New South Wales for that matter.
I'm not a politician, but we didn't, some of them have implications, but we didn't go into wider things. We were operating within New South Wales. But, separate conversation.
Thank you, Mary. I think we'll have some more questions at the end, but there aren't any. Thank you very much.
Our third speaker tonight is Andrew Catchpole, who is a strategic advisor with Hydro Tasmania. Andrew has for the last 20 years been involved in Hydro Tasmania's participation in Australia's national electricity market. His roles have covered market entry and regulation, energy policy and stakeholder engagement, business sustainability and transformation. Most recently, Andrew has had responsibility for corporate strategy, energy policy and regulation, advocacy, engagement and business development for Hydro Tasmania. He is a fellow and former director of the International Hydropower Association and is a trustee of the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. Andrew is currently establishing Catch-On Proprietary Limited, a professional services consultancy assisting clients with development opportunities in the energy, water and resources sector. His talk title tonight is Mitigation Strategies for the Energy Sector. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for slipping in the plug. A man's got to eat. Your Excellency, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. So I don't know if anybody noticed, but the climate scientist dressed for a warming climate, Mary O'Kane and myself dressed for the weather. you know. But it's a rare occasion when I get to talk to a group and follow some people who have given such globally significant insights into the challenges we're facing that talking about energy feels like light relief. But I'm happy to try and provide a little bit of that. Nathan has certainly set me up to talk about the years 2015 and 2016, and I'll get to those. The period that the media christened the energy supply crisis, but that a colleague and friend in government, I think rather more charmingly, called the Troubles. So tonight I would like to talk to you about particularly Australia's challenges in decarbonising our economy, the role of the energy sector globally in Australia and in Tasmania, and emerging challenges for that sector, and also future mitigation strategies required and Tasmania's role in those, and finally how a decarbonised stationary energy sector can make a contribution to helping with the decarbonisation challenges of other sectors. So firstly, the reason we talk about energy is because energy is such a big part of the problem globally. And around about 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions result from energy production and consumption. And roughly a third, very roughly a third of each of those is contributed by transport, by stationary energy, that is electricity generation, and by direct industrial application, so steel production, petrochemical production. But it does vary vastly by region and by country, and if we think about our situation in Tasmania, we are fortunate, of course, that our electricity system is at very low emission, close to zero emission, but we do use a lot of energy in industry. So roughly 2/3 of the electricity that Tasmania has produced is used in the heavy smelting and metals production sectors. The International Energy Agency has projected massive growth in two technologies, wind and solar, if we're to deliver global net zero emissions by 2050. Conversely, the global use of oil, coal and natural gas would need to be virtually eliminated by 2050. Fans of nuclear should notice a slight decrease in relative contribution, but overall a steady participation, and similarly for hydropower. So in considering whether such a challenge that the IEA paints for us globally is even achievable, I think Australia's recent history is instructive. I don't think anyone would claim that Australia has had a consistent, coherent policy framework for decarbonisation of the economy. And yet, with only one supporting national policy, the mandated renewable energy target, and a variety of state-based rooftop solar incentives, Australia has transitioned more than a quarter of its electricity supply to renewables. These policies have done their job by supporting the deployment and scale as technologies progress down the cost curve to become the most competitive new build generation technologies. So wind is now 1/4 of the cost, roughly, of the deployment of nuclear. Solar, probably 1/5 of the cost. Distributed solar now forms 17% of installed generation capacity in the national electricity market, 23% of the total generation capacity in Western Australia. And in a first for Australia, on the 11th of October last year, solar power met all of South Australia's electricity need for the period of hours, all of it, and it has happened several times since. But it's not without consequence. This build-out of distributed renewables, largely solar, along with changes to the underlying demand in our economy, principally because of the transition away from the heavy manufacturing sectors of our economy, has led to a change in the daily demand shape. And this is a thing we call the duck curve. So the duck curve is here representing a typical daily demand profile over 24 hours. And if you look across the top line, we're tracing 10 years ago, 2012, we had a very predictable shape in demand for grid-supplied energy in this country. It was low overnight, it rose to a peak in the middle of the day, backed off a little bit in the afternoon, then rose to a slightly higher evening peak, and the relativities of that varied a little bit between summer and winter, and where you were in the country. In Victoria, for example, air conditioning load in the summer drove a higher evening peak. Tasmania, being a bit odd, but not surprisingly here tonight, is a winter peaking place. But the general shape during the day remains the same. What's happened over those 10 years is that the increasing deployment, particularly of solar PV on rooftops in Australia, but also in more recent years, large-scale solar installations, has hollowed out that demand curve in the middle of the day, producing the belly of our duck. And that creates some very interesting challenges, along with the system stability problems that are created by an increasing share of this variable renewable energy, where the amount contributed by wind and solar can vary quite quickly from minute to minute, certainly from hour to hour. So we've got a few things that we need to deal with. The first is that there's a mismatch between peak solar production during the middle of the day and peak demand in the late afternoon and evening. The strain that is placed on the system stability due to the frequent changes in supply and demand needs to be managed. And there's also an economic strain, and that economic strain is placed on the inflexible coal-fired generators on which we still rely in Australia for a considerable amount of our energy, which are now experiencing circumstances where at particular times of low demand, they are paying the market. This is what negative spot prices imply. Coal-fired generators are paying the market to stay on and be dispatched. There's not too many business models that can sustain that for an extended period of time. But there are great opportunities here, so the changes do create opportunities, firstly for dispatchable energy sources such as hydropower and peaking gas generation, for short duration energy storage, so batteries, that can shift that solar peak from the middle of the day to the evening when the demand peaks. For long duration energy storage, so pumped hydro, that can store excess generation for hours, days, weeks, or even seasonally to cover cloudy days, wind droughts, or seasonal changes. There's opportunity for demand-side response to drop load in response to peak demand. Large industrial users are participants and have been for many years in Australia in providing this. The newer Emergence technology enabled is aggregations of smaller users being able to respond automatically to peaking demand. And more sophisticated technologies such as inverters that allow solar to ride through short duration voltage disturbances and increase the effectiveness and contribution and stability of solar photovoltaics in the grid. Last year, the energy market operator, AEMO, issued its integrated system plan and forecast a range of scenarios of energy mix in Australia to 2040. So as for the IEA global roadmap we looked at earlier, a large build of both wind and large-scale and distributed solar is expected under all scenarios in the ISP. This particular scenario, a mid or economically optimum scenario in their words, more than 26 gigawatts of new variable renewable energy is needed to replace the 2/3 of Australia's coal-fired generation that is expected to retire by 2040. to maintain Australia's dispatchable capacity, which is illustrated by the red line, to meet demand up to 19 gigawatts of new dispatchable resources, so utility scale pumped hydro and battery storage will be required. Now, I'm very well aware that just because I work in energy and I've kind of got some idea what a gigawatt is, 19 gigawatts of storage is 9 snowy 2.0s. There is plenty of opportunity for batteries, pump storage and any other technology that we can come up with to help meet this need in Australia's energy future. So the implication is that a portfolio of varying energy storage durations will be needed to efficiently distribute renewable energy that is available, the resources are there, but to provide it at the correct time requires a range of storage solutions, but also to provide a stable grid that we've become used to support smooth operation of less flexible existing generation. So a combination of fast response, short duration storage, so batteries, and cost-effective long duration storage, pumped hydro, will be part of our future energy solution. And I think everybody's familiar with Snowy 2.0. The recent news in the last couple of weeks is that a project called Kidston in Queensland has just reached its financial close after a rather tortuous process to get secure funding, and now will be built. That's a 250 megawatt 8-hour pumped hydro storage constructed in using the pits of disused mines, open cut mines. So the other investment that we need to make in our grid is to address the fact that through the transmission network we've got connects our old sources of generation, our coal-fired power stations in places like the Latrobe Valley, to the load centres in our cities. It doesn't connect the new sources of generation to our cities. And in particular, AEMO's finding in their ISP is interconnection between regions is critical to optimally utilise the renewable energy resources we have in Australia, and particularly take advantage of the time diversity of those resources. And what I mean by that is that if we're looking at wind as an example, the wind doesn't blow at the same time in all regions of Australia, and it doesn't blow at the same time of day. And in particular in Tasmania, we tend to have windy evenings, and this is measured at our wind farms, just at the time in Victoria when the wind is dropping away. So it's a reasonably consistent pattern. And if we connect all of our regions well across the national grid, we can take advantage of this timing diversity to optimise the use of the energy without having to store it, but simply by moving it around from the place where it is being generated at the time to the place where it's needed. And so to Tasmania. Well, I think a little cheer for Tasmania. Tasmania, as was reported in the media, I think just last weekend, has achieved net zero for the 5th consecutive year after achieving net zero emissions for the first time in 2013. And we are the beneficiary of some happy accidents in that case. The historical investment in renewable energy generation, hydropower, the more recent investment in wind generation, and the carbon sink in the state's forest. So this is just a thing. I think we can give ourselves a little pat on the back. It's not a rousing cheer, perhaps. It depends on what we do next. And so I'd just like to talk about one of the opportunities that we need to consider in Tasmania to look beyond our own shores and consider what role Tasmania can play in the decarbonisation of a wider grid and national electricity market. So since 2006, Tasmania has been contributing dispatchable capacity to the national electricity market via Basslink, a high voltage direct current undersea cable, even when we've been an annual net importer of energy. So the ability to contribute to meeting peak demand is not precluded by Tasmania's status about whether we actually produce enough energy here overall or not. But with Tasmania now 100% self-sufficient in renewable energy on average, additional interconnection by the proposed 1500 megawatt Marinus link would quadruple Tasmania's contribution of dispatchable capacity to the national electricity market. The first proposed cable, 750 megawatts, would utilise latent capacity existing in Tasmania's hydropower system, including, for example, the potential to upgrade the 80-year-old, or in fact replace the 80-year-old Tarraleah power scheme with a new power scheme, a new power station with more than twice the existing capacity. The second cable could be supported by a new pumped hydro development at Lake Sathana that would provide 750 megawatts of capacity, so that's 3 times the size of the Kidston station I just talked about in Queensland. 750 megawatts of capacity and 20 hours of energy storage, so 2.5 times the duration of storage at 3 times the capacity. Just to try and give you some idea of the scale of the potential, that's one pumped hydro that we could develop in Tasmania. We have many opportunities. This is perhaps the preferred one that's emerged from the feasibility studies. Each cable would also unlock the potential to further develop Tasmania's highly competitive wind resources. Now, we know not all locations where you could put up wind towers are appropriate for wind. There are many reasons from environmental, aesthetic, human impact points of view that some locations do not work. But we have, it is estimated, about 4,000 megawatts of undeveloped wind resource in Tasmania. Some significant part of that could be developed, meeting all our highest environmental, social expectations. And so to the exposure that we carry, 20 years of climate research in Tasmania has highlighted risks to Tasmania's hydropower generation. The first of those is changes in rainfall variability, and this is where we go back to 2015-16. The spring of 2015 was the driest spring in our record by a considerable margin. It was unprecedented and it exceeded the worst scenarios that had been modelled to that time. It was then succeeded by some very unfortunate events surrounding the Basslink interconnector, and the confluence of those things led to the aforementioned troubles. And then the other event that Nathan referred to, when the drought broke in late May and then into June of that year, it broke in a big way. It was incredibly wet, even before the very high rainfall event of the 6th of June 2016, which unfortunately is a date I'll probably remember better than my son's birthday. Before that event, it had already got very wet very quickly. And my colleague in the room, Greg, can correct me, but I've got a feeling if you actually added up the total rainfall for the year, for the financial year 2015-16, it was actually not all that far below average, but it was really poorly distributed around the year. So this is the first problem we have to deal with. Shorter, sharper events, very dry seasons, correspondingly very wet seasons, all of which trying to capture that within just the hydropower context, trying to capture that within a system that was designed 50, 80, 100 years ago to capture a pattern of weather inflows that are quite different to what we're experiencing today. The second is an overall declining rainfall trend, fortunately not as bad in Tasmania as experienced in other parts of Australia or the world. So Western Australia comes to mind as a particularly extreme example, but around 10% overall over the last 50 years in Tasmania is a consistent drying trend measured in terms of inflows to the hydropower system. The bushfire impact, Mary's talked a lot about the risk of bushfires, but this manifests both in risk to our very distributed generation assets, which of course are in remote locations, very often surrounded by forests, but also transmission assets. And the generation assets are no good without transmission assets to actually move the energy around. And transmission assets are particularly vulnerable to bushfire. And they don't look it, you know, the large, fairly ugly, in some people's opinion, steel structured towers that carry long metal conductors, so they don't look particularly vulnerable, but they are to heat. So basically those lines, when they get hot, they stretch. When they stretch, they get closer to the ground. When they get closer to the ground, you have to decrease the amount of energy running through them for risk of them arcing to the ground. And guess what? Bushfire smoke makes it worse because smoke acts as a conductor which will rapidly increase the likelihood that those transmission lines arc out. So we had the situation, one of the reasons, as Mary said, we didn't have such a bad 1920 bushfire season, but we had a pretty bad 1819 one. And Tasmania went very close to having certainly parts of the state blacked out, not because bushfires were actually threatening the physical assets of transmission, but because the smoke was constraining the ability of the transmission system to move the energy around. So we do have mitigations. Mitigations include research on both the impacts and improving the forecasting skill over seasonal and multi-year timeframes. Investments in asset and human life protection. Mary talked about roads. Consider the situation and the dilemma we face here with our people, sending them to protect a power station that lies in the middle of the bush with one road in and out, and it's probably narrow. So energy is an essential service. We understand the chaos that ensues if you actually lose an energy supply, particularly during another existing emergency such as a bushfire. But it's a very difficult choice to understand how we can safely deploy our people to defend those assets during a bushfire. So improving things like access to power stations, prevention, preparation are pretty key. But also I think we've seen examples of of the importance of strategic positioning of backup generation, and the experience in New South Wales fires, of course those coastal communities, Mallacoota comes to mind, there were places that were cut off and were without power, and the recovery from bushfire is greatly hampered when power assets are destroyed, and there's weeks. Not bushfire, but the wind event in Victoria a couple of weeks ago sees, you know, a very large number of Victorian customers still without power after that event, particularly in the Dandenongs. So we've got these impacts on our system, which has centralised generation, distributed consumption, and a great vulnerability to weather events. So despite its challenges, I think the electricity sector is one of the technologically easier sectors to address emissions, in that the challenges are largely economic and transitional rather than technological. So we do have opportunities to consider how the sector can contribute to decarbonisation of other sectors. And in the table, we'll just look at immediate and subsequent opportunities to decarbonise through electrification. So we have those things that are suitable for scaling now, where we can quickly and cost effectively benefit through electrification of those sectors using available technologies and at our current emissions intensity. Those that are marked later will benefit at future expected emissions intensities or rely on technologies under development. And then there are those that are hard to electrify, such as long-haul transport, where energy storage becomes prohibitive. And finally, this is where hydrogen comes in, because it is not possible in this country at the moment to do a presentation on energy without talking about hydrogen, as illogical or as uneconomic as it may seem. But hydrogen does provide a potential energy intermediary between electricity and end-use applications. It will be critical ultimately to addressing some of the harder to decarbonise end-use applications that require energy-dense fuels and where weight matters. Hydrogen is already cost competitive in diesel replacement applications in heavy transport in the form of ammonia. In Tasmania, we've been exporting electricity since the 1960s as aluminium. 70% of the input cost of producing aluminium is electricity cost. Possibly less acutely and more directly, since the 2000s we've been exporting it via the Basslink interconnector that I mentioned before. And perhaps in the future we'll be exporting energy that we've generated as renewable electricity in Tasmania and turned into a hydrogen carrier. Tasmania has significant early mover advantages in green hydrogen production through being 100% renewable, having an established dispatchable generation base that can support high electrolyser utilisation, and competitive renewable energy resources that are still to be developed. However, the competitive advantage will erode over time as other jurisdictions decarbonise their electricity generation. So now's the time for Tasmania to consider its role in global energy supply in 2050. Thank you for your attention. I'm very happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there any questions? One over here.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I have a couple of questions just because I'm not really familiar with some of these bodies that you mentioned from the graphs that you showed. One of them was the 2020 AEMO Integrated System Plan, Optimal Development Pathway Outlook. It was showing, how we can change our energy usage and things. And I'm wondering what this organisation is and if is the government implementing these plans? Have we got a plan for this is going to happen? Is this what we want to happen? And the other one that I was wondering about was also the Climate Works 2050 Priorities for Climate Change. I don't know who that organisation is again and whether they have any ability to compel governments to make these changes.
Certainly. So the easy answer is that the first one is doing stuff and the second one is telling us what we should do. AEMO is the Australian Energy Market Operator, so they are actually responsible for the management and dispatch of the energy supply in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania and South Australia. So much of this is what we call the national electricity market. They are also charged by the federal and state governments collectively through National Cabinet in producing a plan every second year now. So 2018 was the first one, 2020 the second one, another one scheduled for 2022 that does actually forecast the likely changes under a couple of different scenarios of speed of change and economic factors in the generation mix in Australia, and also with supporting and bringing it about.
One more question here and then we'll go to the session.
Rooftop PV. I understood, it has the advantage that it's not a central producer, it's spread around. Whatever happens in one place has to happen in a hell of a lot of places to damage rooftop PV. I thought there was a difficulty with it in, if you like, its relationship to existing grids, that grids were not really very well set up for widespread input from rooftop PV. Is that just a myth on my part? Is that correct? And could you pass comment?
It's correct in the sense that if we view our system as static and what we've got is what we've got, then you add a lot of rooftop PV to it and it makes it very difficult for distribution companies to manage a stable grid. It also makes the economics difficult because, of course, We're reducing the amount of energy that we take the grid, perhaps to zero, perhaps we become a contributor to the grid. So how does the grid actually get paid for? Because the grid is not a free service. It has a cost of being there. It has a cost of being maintained. Being the optimist that I am, these are simply transitional problems. You know, they're difficult if you're TasNetworks, the owner and operator of the grid in Tasmania, and my respect to my colleagues there who are managing this in real time, but it is a problem that needs to be solved. It's a bit like the problem that needs to be solved that we need to actually reinvest in our transmission network nationally or broadly under a set of rules that were really set up for a static situation, but we don't have a static situation. We have a transition in the way that we source our energy in this country.
Thank you, Andrew. All three speakers to come up the front. We'll have a relatively short, I know we're running a little bit over time, but I think we'll have time for about 10 minutes of question and answer. Pick a microphone. So this is a general...
From an online person, if I could start.
Yes.
Question is, won't the proposed hydrogen plant at Bell Bay take care of any extra electricity we produce? That is, aren't we putting ourselves at risk with this cable?
I think that one might be to me. So it's an interesting thing. So Tasmania currently produces, on average, and I keep on emphasising that because we also talk about this variability, but on average we produce as much energy as we consume. How do we manage the difference now? Well, because on any given time we can, one, store energy in the massive amount of hydropower storage we have in Tasmania, and two, we can import and export over the existing interconnector. A new hydrogen plant at scale will require more energy. Probably the best answer for Tasmania is for us to build appropriate wind farms to power that, so to match that new load. And why I say the best answer is because that maximises the economic activity and the benefit that arises in Tasmania. At larger scale, and the scale is very important for hydrogen production. If there were to be a large-scale hydrogen plant in Tasmania, and it would need to be large-scale ultimately to be globally competitive in its cost of production, then it would be of a scale where we would need a lot of wind developed in Tasmania, and then we'd suffer from the variability problem. It's either windy and we're producing more wind than the hydrogen plant can take, or it's not very windy and we're not producing enough energy for the hydrogen plant. And this is where it works in concert with the Marinus interconnector or interconnection to the mainland to balance those oversupply and undersupply. So when it's very windy, we export the excess. When we don't have enough, we import it back. And given that Victoria is rapidly moving to a large amount of solar and excess solar, we can see the duck curve means there's already excess solar in the system. One of the cheapest ways to get energy is to buy excess energy when it's very cheap and it's in oversupply. And so Marinus would work to import it. We can manage some of the storage using the hydropower system and maintain a very cost-efficient production of hydrogen, in theory.
Are there any other questions online?
I've got three, I've got two more. Do you want to do them now? Another question about cables. Should our cables and other above-ground lines be put underground? I am referring to the latest damage done to power lines in Victoria.
That's you again, Andrew.
It is, and I'm going to largely duck it because I'm not a transmission guy and it's a question for TasNetworks. But I think one of the mitigations certainly for risk of exposure is undergrounding of cables, and one of the questions that we need to grapple with, I think it's fair to say, is the cost-benefit equation or the cost-risk equation, the additional cost of undergrounding versus the risk mitigation that you get out of it.
Thank you. Next one.
And last question we have at the moment, it's again you, Andrew, sorry. Have you any comments about the role of hydrogen storage in Tasmania in contributing to methane emissions?
Hydrogen storage in Tasmania contributing to methane emissions. So I'm a little unclear on what the question is implying. Generally speaking, hydrogen, if it were produced in Tasmania, would be for one of two applications: for domestic applications in transport as a fuel, or for export. The idea of using hydrogen for storage, if it means, as some people talk about, using, when you've got surplus electricity, turning it into hydrogen, storing it, and then using a fuel cell to turn it back into electricity, it works, but it's horribly inefficient. It's got a round-trip efficiency of less than 40%. So there's just no sensible way I could see that you would do it.
Thank you. Are there other questions in the room? Preferably for Mary or Nathan.
Happy to answer.
Remembering Mary also has something to do with electricity industry.
And has the CEO of Aurora here too. So.
Thank you for your for each of your presentations. They're all illuminating. So thank you, Mary. Particularly to you, having been Chief Scientist of New South Wales, and clearly we're talking about climate change, but don't limit to that. What is the point of a chief scientist, and in terms of why might Tasmania really need one, or use,
I've often been caught on this one here because I visit. So the first question, just so I hear it correctly, was what was the point of the chief scientist? In New South Wales, it has an interesting starting point. Even though most of the universities in New South Wales, or all the universities, are under state acts, the universities had drifted from the state government, and the state government of the late 2000s, like 2008-9, felt it was really important to have good links to the university so they could draw on their expertise, and that they could push up the innovation agenda, because Australia's productivity growth, of course, was starting to go off very badly over that decade, and link the universities and the government to industry more. So the role of the chief scientist was to make everyone talk to everyone else and do things and play nicely together. When the Liberal government got in, the Liberal national government came in, the O'Farrell government, they added an extra role to it, which was particularly to provide advice. So the first big piece of advice was the coal seam gas report, but there were lots of things: koalas, energy security, you name it, we did reports on it. And as well as that, I think an important extra role was helping find research funding for particularly our universities and linking things. Does Tasmania need one? I think that's up to Tasmania. I wouldn't presume to tell. I mean, I think New South Wales has clearly liked the role. They've gone on, they've appointed Hugo and White after me. Several other states have them, but, I think it's a state-by-state decision.
I think all states have them in one form or another, apart from us.
I've heard that before too.
Okay, thank you. I'm really sorry, but I'm going to go back to Andrew again. There's a lot of concern about the Marinus link, in that we're going to be exporting a lot of energy that, if we were to, when we convert our manufacturing sectors, our industrial sectors, our transport and our agricultural sectors to renewable energy, that energy is going to be needed here. And so then we will have to build more wind farms and more power sources. And these power sources have a huge economic cost and a huge environmental cost, such as the planned wind farm on Robben Island, which is a very important ecosystem area. So how is it possible to export via Marinus at the same time as we need the energy ourselves?
Certainly, and look, entirely good and appropriate questions. So for me, this is the debate that Tasmania needs to have. It is possible to do these things, and I regard my role in these things to help us understand what is
technically and economically possible. Tasmanian society as a whole needs to have a conversation and use both the planning frameworks that we have for particular projects to assess an individual project, but more broadly when we're talking about large concepts such as the Marinus Link, to understand what is the right choice for Tasmania. So it's one thing, you can't have that debate unless you first understand what is technically and economically possible, but then over all of that is what is socially desirable, and that's a whole of community conversation.
No, use the microphone. People online need to hear it.
Oh, fine. Yeah. So is that conversation going to be had, or is it a foregone conclusion that we're going to be the battery of a nation? Do we really have a discussion around this? Do you know?
I don't feel it's a foregone conclusion. I've been part of the conversation for 4 years, and I'm not sitting here going, well, I can see anybody who's made that decision. Certainly for Marinus Link, there's a very robust and extensive process to work through, and then subsequently any particular power development has a planning process and framework and public policy assessment process to work through.
Thank you, Andrew. We've got one more question online, and then I think we're going to have to call it an evening. So, David?
Going back to the question of methane emissions, could you comment on the contribution to methane emissions from hydro storages?
Yes, I could. I'll try and keep it brief because it's one of those topics that there's been lots of done on. And the answer is that hydro storages, hydro impoundments, under certain circumstances can be quite high methane emitters at different stages of their life cycle, usually in the early stages after impoundment, when essentially you've got a lot of vegetation that you've inundated as rotting and emitting methane. Where you are in the world matters, and the nature and shape of the storage matters. So equatorial high temperature environments typically emit a lot more methane than cold environments. A lot of this work has been done, for example, between Central American hydropower developments contrasted with Canadian hydropower developments. We've had the Canadians out here to measure Tasmania's storages, and Tasmania's storages, not surprisingly, are a little more like Canadian ones than Venezuelan ones. So shallow storages in the early stages of their impoundment in high temperature environments tend to emit a lot of methane. Cold water storages, deep storages tend to emit relatively small amounts of methane. There is a methane spike usually for a few years after the initial commissioning, and then it flattens out, particularly in our kind of cold water environments, to a very low level.
Well, thank you for the question and answer session. I'd first of all like to start, if I can, in wrapping up this evening by thanking all three speakers for their stimulating and insightful talks, and clearly at least some of them attracted very many questions which I seem to have remembered before in a similar environment perhaps 30 or 40 years ago. So if I could ask the three speakers to come up, I'd just like to give them a token of our thanks. No, there was something else. Secondly, I'd like to thank, if I can, all the volunteers tonight who have made this possible. We have been both online and in person. It took considerable effort of a lot of people, volunteers, to actually make this possible and feasible. It's actually really good to see a face-to-face audience after about 18 months of not having face-to-face audiences in this sort of regime. So thank you everybody for coming along, and thank you very much to the volunteers for making it possible. The talks tonight, as Mary said earlier, will be recorded and they will go up on the Royal Society of Tasmania YouTube channel in the next few days. And again, just thank you very much for making the effort on a very cold Tasmanian night to come out in person and hear these talks, and also to the people online. I think the total attendance tonight, engagement with this event, is slightly over 300 if we include the people who have registered online and those who are here in person. So that's a really good total, and I hope the talks have been really informative and led to further understanding of the issues and how we might be able to mitigate climate change.